make.
Sorry.
Okay, a few announcements. On February 16th, that's a Tuesday at 1 o'clock on Zoom, we're going to have our midwinter business meeting. At that point, we'll present a slate of 7 women who are willing to serve, and that is to find members for the next year for the board. It's chaired by Diana Barbieri. And if anybody is interested in running for a board position, please contact her. We will need a quorum of 18 in order to accept the slate. So I'm put this on your calendar. We will be emailing information about this closer to the time. The next announcement really concerns board etiquette or Zoom etiquette. Some of you have had issues with not having the speaker in the big box and a lot of distractions from noise and so forth. So I want to review our protocol with you. Jessica has helped us enormously with this. And I just want to tell you, to prevent hearing voices or background noises, all attendees should mute or turn off the audio icon. And it will be confirmed by a red line through that icon. And that way, only the speaker can be heard. Your dog, your conversations, your phone, whatever, we won't hear it. It won't be a distraction. To give the speaker a full view screen, turn off or mute the video icon. Again, there'll be a red line through that icon. By doing this, the speaker will be on the main screen, and your names will, or photos, whatever, will appear on the small boxes on the top or side of the screen. And then when the speaker presses, or host, presses the share screen icon, she can then visually share information with us. When it's time for questions from attendees, each one can unmute the mic and be heard by all. After a question, the mic should be muted again. Although Kathy may be, I don't know whether she would prefer the chat, and I don't have instructions for that. But that you'll tell us when that goes. Okay, and then the third thing I have to tell you is that we are going to be having monthly raffles that are available to members of the club or to anybody else. This month will be a 50-50 raffle, and the winner will be drawn on February 16th after the program. Tickets are $10 a piece. This will be a part of our fundraising effort, so I hope that all of you will participate. You can send a check or cash or whatever to the Manor Club, and we will record your names and put them in the basket for drawing. So right now, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Celeste Coughlin, who's our co-chair for the programs, and she will introduce Catherine Lavery. Thank you.
Thank you, Alice. Well, it's a wonderful day here in Pelham with the snow falling. What better time than to listen to about serial murderers? I'm loving it. I can hardly wait. Dr. Lavery is a Clark University sociology graduate and began her pursuit of a criminal justice PhD by training in sexual victimization and trauma. She then attended Iona College and was the first woman to graduate from its MS degree program in criminal justice. Her PhD specialization is in forensic psychology and ethics from the Graduate Center at CUNY, led her back to Iona College, where she served until recently as professor. Currently, she is the graduate coordinator and chair at the Criminal Justice Department. And was recently appointed chair for the Department of Criminal Justice and Security at Pace University, overseeing the undergraduate and graduate programs at NYC and Pleasantville campuses. We are thrilled to have you back with us. You are back surely by popular demand, and welcome to all of your students. I hope you all enjoy listening as much as we will. I introduce you with pleasure to Dr. Catherine Lavery.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to share the screen and excuse the professorial mode. I thought what I would do is get through the slideshow, and then we can open it up to question and answer as we go forward. So I just thought lay the groundwork for a discussion that we have. So as I start this, I am definitely not a computer savvy person. That's what I leave for my students to do. So what we're going to look today, and I just like to give a general overview on serial crime motives and the typologies. We'll look at the different categories of it. So I became hooked on this in 1991, saw Silence of the Lambs, and saw it at the Pelham Picture House, and looked to my friend who was sitting next to me. And when the lights came up in the theater, we were both staring at the screen, and she said, "I'm going to be a police officer." And I said, "I want to be Clarice Starling, but I don't want a gun." To which her retort was, "Nobody in the tri-state area will ever give you one." So that's where I started to look into the area of criminology, and then found my path in research and in teaching. And as well, I do a lot of training and educational programs on this. But serial crime was actually kind of my first, it sounds bizarre, love in terms of my entrance into the criminal justice system. I did my thesis on it. I did a lot of research on it. I started to work with offenders from it, and also started to work more with victims as I kind of moved up the totem pole in academia. So I thought today we could kind of give an overview, and then we can talk about what's happening. There have been significant serial cases that have actually been in the news recently, or at least over the past year. You know, in spite of COVID and the new administration coming in, and all the turmoil we've had in 2020, there have been some real highlights of serial crime that have kind of made it to the forefront in terms of investigations and in terms of what we're seeing. So what I'd like to do is just go through it, and then I'd like to kind of tie it into how serial crime actually helps law enforcement and victimologists and other criminal justice practitioners in the way we look at crime today, okay? So I'm just going to go through an overview. We'll kind of cover the basis, look at offenders. I'm going to kind of go over the cycle of the killing process for many of them. But please note, these are more of like based on aggregate data. So every serial killer is very individualistic in terms of their motives. None of them usually have one motive that they like to operate on. There are a multitude of reasons for why they do it, and they usually stem from something that happens in early childhood. But we're then going to look at how studying these offenders will help us looking forward, not just into the trends of the investigations, but also how we look at other types of crimes that exist in our country. So I wanted to put the disclaimer. I don't have graphic pictures. I'm mindful of that, but some of the content area may be a little disturbing. So I just wanted to let you know as we move forward. Okay, and this won't move. 1 second. Okay. All right, so first I think we have to look at why are we so fascinated with serial crime? And I think we have to go back a little bit to Jack the Ripper in the 1880s. And also with our first, I would say our first real serial killer for the United States, who was H.H. Holmes in 1894. Some of you may have read the wonderful book, Devil in the White City, which looked at the World's Fair in Chicago in the 1800s and how H.H. Holmes set up what he called a crematorium, where he would marry women and bring wealthy men in and then murder them for their money and then get rid of their bodies. And that was really, I think, our first parlay into serial crime. But to be quite honest, the term serial crime did not start until the 1960s. It wasn't until two researchers, Ronald Holmes and James DeBurger, really came up with 4 basic categories of serial crime. And this was reflective with what was going on in the 1960s with Charles Manson and Richard Speck and some of the other more well-known ones that we have seen. And I think where it became extremely popular, I know we focus a lot on, and we'll get into the TV and media part of it, it really started in 1983. And in 1983, John Douglas, who many of you may know is one of the premier profilers, he was one of the founding members of the behavioral science unit for the FBI. He was, in Silence of the Lambs as one of the characters. He's been technical advisor to many television and movies on it. And he's really been the focal point of profiling. But John Douglas kind of made a big mistake. As the crime rates were going up across the United States, we were looking at how we were counting victims. And he made off the remark comment at a press conference stating that we have about 20,000 victims of crime. Basically, these are missing women and children. And he basically said they're all victims of serial crime. And that really started a moral panic in our society, where now we started to kind of look at people like, who's a serial killer? Now, all of that has been retracted, and I'll get into kind of a real statistical overview of how many realistically exist. But I think it was from the mid-'80s we started to see kind of our fascination and I'll say relationship with serial crime really start. So here I have, some of you may even recognize some of these. Lonnie Franklin in the top right, who was the grim sleeper, he just actually passed away. And out of the norm of typologies of serial crime, as a Black man, murdered over 90 victims. Some of you may obviously know David Berkowitz. There's Myra Hindley. I put down BTK, and there are a few, and we'll go through a few of them, and obviously the Zodiac and Jack the Ripper. So from the reality of what we were seeing in the news, and it started to transform into media and entertainment. And some of these you may remember, Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins, as in Silence of the Lambs, he became one of the first serial killers who became beloved. Everyone saw the movie, everyone loved Anthony Hopkins. The Gen X people who saw American Psycho with Christian Bale became mortified, but we still thought he was hot. And then as we move forward, we saw Dexter, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Michael Myers, we've had an obsession with, since the 70s. And from that, it's kind of morphed off into other areas of media. So for example, Netflix had such a hit show with Mindhunter. And we've also now seen Prodigal Son on Channel 5 with, the brilliant actor Michael Sheen playing one of the worst types of serial killers you could ever imagine. So we have actually welcomed them into our home and enjoyed watching them over and over again. So we have to ask ourselves, why does this fascination occur? And why, when we look at the reality of it, even though we can understand the horror of it, we still embrace it within the fantasy. So we need to look at that and how our perceptions of serial crime interact. So what I'd like to do first is talk about what is a serial killer, because there is a lot of misinformation and multiple types of definitions of a serial killer. Technically speaking, a serial killer is an individual who commits 3 or 4 murders. Now, the reason why I say 3 or 4 is criminologists actually still debate this. There's one faction of criminologists that say 3 people, that's it, now it's a serial crime. Others say, well, 3, not as terrible, we gotta go to 4. And there's literally a debate that has been in existence since the 1980s about it. But the key is whether you agree with 3, 4, 5, it's done in a systemic, almost like a cycle of a fantasy. And in between each kill, there is what we call a cooling off period. And this is where the rush of the kill for the offender kind of takes over after the kill, and they calm down, and then they start again with the fantasy life, and then it starts to build again. Normally, there is some form of patterning that occurs with each serial killer. It can either be in victim selection, it could be with the method or the motive, or what we call the modus operandi of the offender. But it's really important for us to note that we have other types of multiple murderers that exist that we classify in other categories. And the other two major categories are mass killers and spree killers. We have had ongoing problems really in the field with how do we classify certain people, and why is it a mass killer, a serial killer, but just all at once. So I want to walk through those two, and then we can kind of get into the characteristics of a serial killer. So a mass killer is somebody, and I have, you know, Sung Chi, who was from the Virginia Tech. I also have John List, who was from Jersey, and he actually murdered his family. He's what's known as a family annihilator, and then went over and moved to Arizona and reconstructed a new life and family there. A mass killer kills 3 to 4 people in one time. There is no cooling off period, because after it happens, they either are apprehended, or they, like List, move on to a new life, or they commit suicide. But there, within mass killers, there are 8 different types. And I'm not going to go through those, that's another lecture. But school shootings, the family annihilator, incidents of terrorism can fall into this. And so that's one type of classification. Where we see most of the confusion is with the spree killer. And a spree killer is an individual who kills more than 3 people, but there's a very short cooling off period in between. I think one of the most famous ones is Andrew Cunanan, who murdered Gianni Versace in 1987. Andrew Cunanan literally came from California to New York, New Jersey, Maryland, down to Florida in his crime spree. And it went from April of 1997 until July, until he committed suicide after Gianni Versace's assassination. So from that, we saw a string of 6 or more homicides. However, it's not serial. So another example, which many of you may have seen, the Martin Sheen movie Badlands, which is actually one of my favorite movies with him and Sissy Spacek. And that has to deal with the Charles Starkweather and Carolyn and Fugate case. She was 14 years old. He was much older. He was about 30, and they had an affair together, and then they murdered her family. And within about a 3-week period from December 57 until January 58, he murdered 11 people. And what was so interesting was within the span of about 9 days, that's when 10 of the people were killed. And then he was apprehended. And even though there's been a lot of debate of how much Fugate was involved, especially with the murder of her own family members, she was able to kind of deal with that. So spree, there is a beginning and an end and cooling periods in between. Serial, the cooling off periods can be weeks, months, years. If you look at BTK, there was 11 years in between certain homicides. Ted Bundy escalated, and at one point it was literally 2 days in between each murder. So it just all depends on the methodology and also the personality of the individual. So what makes a serial killer? Are they mentally ill? There has been a lot of debate on whether or not they're just simply evil and born bad. How many specific types of serial killers do we have? How are we able to sort the differences? And where does serial crime right now? How do we see it in our society? So I have pictures up, that's Carol Bundy, no relation to Ted Bundy, who worked with Douglas Clark. They were called the Sunset Boulevard murders, and they murdered all different types of people. She actually murdered a couple of her ex-boyfriends, and Douglas helped her. And we really don't know how many. He was on the hunt for prostitutes, basically. Above him is Bobby Joe Long, who was executed a couple of years ago, finally. He was known in Florida as the ad man rapist and raped over 80 women, and then graduated in escalation from rape to sexual homicide. And he ended up killing 14 women. So, you know, and that's one thing I want to definitely talk about in a second is, you know, how do they begin the process of this? But before that, I want to look and kind of give a reality check on serial crime, because I think if we watch Criminal Minds and all the other shows, and I remember when CSI had like 5 different shows on at one time, and Law and Order had like 30 different versions at one time, we were just completely, I mean, our televisions were penetrated with crime all the time and the level of violence. Now with, you know, the ID station and Oxygen, we can kind of keep it in their silos with viewers, but it's actually amazing, you know, how we can kind of lose the scope of what the reality is with these rates. Indicates globally 3,000 to 5,000 victims are attributed to serial crime, but we have problems with classifications. So for example, if we look at individuals who are involved in organized crime, hired hits, are they serial killers? Absolutely. And they are a certain characteristic of a serial killer. But do we consider them serial killers? We don't, because we look at them as, well, they work for organized crime. So it's a different typology. So, you know, also victims of human trafficking, you know, women who are murdered because they're moved, or those who are involved with narcotics trafficking. There are many people who may be involved who really are serial killers, but it's looked at as a job. So, and we also, as criminal justice professionals, misclassify them. So that's a big problem. Researchers believe at any time in the United States, we have between 40 and 100 active serial killers. Now, are they doing it every day? No. Some may be in prison, some may be aging out, some may be in transit. You know, I am more on the lower side. I feel comfortable when I teach this with my students to say about 50 to 75, including all states and territories by the United States. Because, you know, there are periods where they stop killing. So, you know, there is no consistency. We don't know how bad they're going to get moving forward. Another issue that has to do with how we classify them is something known as linkage blindness. And linkage blindness has to do with the fact that you have, you know, police agencies that may be handling, you know, 3 murders of prostitutes in Detroit. Now, something could be happening in Chicago, but Detroit doesn't pick up the phone and call Chicago and say, listen, we found 3 women. Do you have something similar? Because when they get the case, they want to solve the case and they want to focus on the case. We've gotten much better since 9/11 with information sharing and information intelligence gathering. So it's a little smoother now. And that's why I think we're apprehending a lot of serial criminals before they escalate into larger amounts of victims, because we are talking more. But I think one of the greatest cases where we saw linkage blindness really serve as a failure to the criminal justice system was the Green River killer with Gary Ridgway. We had California, Oregon, and Washington state. None of them were talking to each other. And there was one journalist who was going in between all the states saying, you know, these women in Green River, you know, they're being dumped here, they're being dumped there. And it wasn't until he published the book where they all said, oh, maybe we should have been talking to each other. And unfortunately, with Gary Ridgway, he's copped to about 90 of them, but we think there may be upwards of 300 victims under him. And so we have to think, if the authorities back in the day were talking to one another, would they have been able to really kind of feel, you know, understand and maybe prevent some of these crimes? Okay. Can I just ask people coming in, because I'm getting some background noise, to all mute right now? just having a problem. I have to move to the next. Okay. Okay, so general characteristics. And what I mean by that, I really mean general. And I'm going to talk about some interesting trends that are happening right now. Who are serial killers? Most of them are men. They've always been men. They will probably always be men. And I think that has a lot to do with the personality structure of a serial killer. They tend to be in their 20s and 30s. Believe it or not, serial killers age out. And the only way we know about this is because as we get older, as I always say to my students, it's a lot harder to bury a body at 45 than it is at 25. And that really is what happens to them. They still have the fantasy to do it. They still may want to go on a hunt. They still may want to go kill, but their body will fail them at that point. So it's kind of like they give up as they get older. We have seen some serial killers in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, but it's been very, very rare. In fact, most of the serial killers we see over the age of 60 are women, and they tend to be more like what we call the Black Widows, where they're killing their husbands over and over again. Or, you know, we had Dorothy Puetta, who was killing people who were living in her house and as she was renting. So crimes overall tend to be what we call intraracial, meaning between the same race. However, we have seen a significant increase since 2010 with Black serial killers. And what we have found when exhibiting white serial killers versus Black versus Latino and other divisions of race and ethnicity, Black serial killers tend to be interracial. So that's very interesting because whereas the typology for many white serial killers has been a specific form of victim selection, for example, Ted Bundy, most of his victims had shoulder length brown hair and were white females, college age or early 20s. That was very reflective of his sister. It was very reflective of his fiance. It tends to be more generalized with Black serial killers. So this is still very new because we've never really seen an increase with that particular race. So this is a new area we're starting to examine. Average to high intelligence. They have to have average intelligence because a lot of them are moving around, they're moving bodies. Normally the kill site is not necessarily the disposal site of the body. So there's a lot of thinking, planning, and premeditation that goes into this. We have found that they do suffer from severe childhood trauma, emotional, physical, psychological, sexual abuse as children, and it's done very early on. And that way, as their personalities are developing, it almost becomes cemented by the time they're 16 or 18. And that's when the fantasies begin to cultivate. Controlling mothers, absent fathers. But what we really look at is the fantasy compulsion and the lack of impulse control that they tend to have. There's a very famous theory called the McDonald's triad. It's been largely debunked. However, I think most practitioners believe if an individual or a child suffers from 2 or all of these symptoms, we will have some problem with this child in terms of behavior, cognitive development, and personality development. So what McDonald thought is, a lot of serial killers actually were wetting the bed until they were almost preteen. Many of them abused small animals. Many of them were interested in fire setting, but not the fire setting like 10-year-olds do, where they see the slug and they put the microscope over it and they, that's different. We're talking real elements of pyromania that occur. So we still consider this. We just kind of don't group them all under it. And we don't expect that every serial killer falls into all of these characteristics. So another thing we have to look at with serial crime is, and this is a concept, I know if many people watched Mindhunter, you saw they discussed the organized versus the disorganized killer. The disorganized killer is usually someone who is at the lower spectrum of intelligence. They tend to be geographically stable. They don't really travel. They have a bad car, or, you know, if they commit a crime, it's only within a 5-mile radius of where they live. And they usually don't put a lot of effort into when they dispose the bodies, as opposed to an organized serial killer who is very, what we consider transient. They may travel to different states. They may go on the highway to look for victims. They like to confuse law enforcement. They actually like to toy with law enforcement a lot, do like a cat and mouse with them. They will dispose of bodies and sometimes put them in undetectable sites, or sometimes they'll put them right out in the open where they display them and they do some form of staging. They want to bring attention and they want media attention. Organized tend to be more on the higher intelligence spectrum because of how, you know, they do their kill. And there tends to be more premeditation with an organized killer. I'm sorry, this is acting up. Okay. So before we get into the 4 basic types that we see, I want to just give a little bit of information, because a lot of times we look at serial crime and we relate it to sexual homicide or rape and homicide. That's not necessarily true. There are many serial killers that do not engage with rape or torture. It has to do with whatever category they fit into and whatever their real motives are. However, we are able to link certain sexual paraphilias, or what we consider disorders, that happen early on in someone's life, that it can contribute or be reflected in their adult life. So, you know, a paraphilia, if you don't know what it is basically the other side or besides loving. You guys, I'm sure, are very familiar with pedophilia, which is loving of children abnormally. And that's how we kind of look at it. Voyeurism, exhibitionism, obscene phone calls that are done routinely, those are all considered sexual paraphilias. So the reason why I put this in is because nobody wakes up and becomes a serial killer. There is a certain escalation from this early childhood trauma, which contributes to these abnormal behaviors and disorders that will lead to the escalation of the violence. So I don't want to discount the issue of sexual homicide because it's very pertinent, but unfortunately with movies like Silence of the Lambs and series like, you know, Criminal Minds and Mindhunter, we tend to automatically categorize them as being linked with sexual homicide, and that's not true. So what a sexual homicide is with serial killers that are involved sexually with the victim, but not all what we call sex murders express certain sexual needs. So for example, the reason why this is helpful to us is we begin as researchers to differentiate. So for example, what is the difference between a burglary versus what we consider a sex burglary? You know, a regular burglary, you may see an apartment ransacked and you may see jewelry removed, but a burglar doesn't necessarily go through someone's laundry or someone's washing machine or someone's dryer. If you see that type of evidence, then you have to say to yourself, what were they looking for? Were they looking for lingerie? Were they looking for brassieres? So we've been able from this analysis to look at different typologies of sexual behavior that can link with serial crime. For example, what is a rape murder? A lot of people will think, well, the serial killer will rape the victim and then kill them. But if we look at Ted Bundy, you know, he actually said it during trial. He really killed them to not just get rid of the witness, meaning the victim, but he couldn't perform sexually while they were alive. He was a necrophiliac, and that was his sexual paraphilia. So he actually raped them post-mortem in most of his cases. So, you know, those are the little nuances that as researchers we need to really focus on so we can give a better explanation as to the disorders that are connected and to the personality components of the individual. Lust killings, they like to torture and rape, and that's what I would consider what you see in a typical horror movie or on Criminal Minds. But Ressler and Douglas, John Douglas and Burgess, who, if you did watch Mindhunter, they were the three main characters, even though their life histories are very different than what was portrayed on Netflix. But they created the sexual homicide motivational model, which was really in 1988, the first clinical research of serial killers, where they went and interviewed them and were able to categorize behaviors and find correlations and similarities with how they behaved. So we look at that as kind of the foundation of research, but there's been so much more since. So the major types of serial killers. If you type in on Google serial crime and characteristics, there will be 9,000 books that come up. Probably 5,000 of them will be textbooks, and you can read all of them and they will all read very differently. I have always gravitated to the initial Holmes and DeBurger from 1968. And actually, Ronald Holmes and his son Stephen actually refined it in 1998. And I'm not happy with all of them. I don't think anybody who's a criminologist is ever going to be happy with different divisions unless they create them, you know. But I find out of all of the different theories that are out here, this makes real sense when explaining, especially to college students and graduate students, how we have to look at them. I think this is one of the better theoretical constructs that we have. So we'll go through the four. So the visionary serial killer, and this is usually someone who may be psychotic or definitely suffer from a delusional mental illness. They hear voices, they may have visions. They can normally be labeled insane or incompetent, but we've actually, with our sentencing guidelines, have changed that. So if you are a serial killer, you really can't claim insanity anymore. That's a court issue. But, and they don't normally engage in staging of a crime. They just kind of go in and do it, and then they leave. So David Berkowitz actually fits under this category pretty nicely. And some have argued Charles Manson as well, even though we don't know how many people Manson really killed. Now we know he did kill. He didn't kill in the Tate LaBianca murders, which were so famous, but he did commit murder and homicide based on his philosophy of this new world he wanted to create. So the visionary is there. And so it's an important one, but most of them do, if not all, end up in prison. They don't go to mental hospitals. We just don't look at it like that anymore in the justice system. The mission serial killer is an individual who will be very functional. They will hold jobs. They will be connected with their family. The problem is that they have this fantasy that they have been put in charge to eradicate a certain type of person or some sort of another human being who meets certain characteristics. So two examples I put were the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway, and New York's serial killer, Joel Rifkin, who's underneath. They both believed that prostitutes needed to be eradicated and that they needed to go. So they would go out hunting for them. So it really had nothing to do with a personal, like, sexual impulse that they had. They really wanted to get rid of them. So that's very important to understand. There is a mission that is involved, and there is a means to an end with why they are doing this. The hedonistic serial killer, and I think the last one, are probably the two more common ones that we see that are associated with the news stories and with film and with television. There's a subtype called the lust and thrill killer, and that's where, Alice, we were talking at the beginning about recreational killers, and they would fall into this category. They just get a thrill to do it. and they get some sort of satisfaction from it. Most likely it's a sexual empowerment satisfaction feature that they have. They don't suffer from a mental illness, so to speak. They do have a character disorder and a personality disorder that has started from early childhood. And in the hedonistic, we do see a real connection between sexual gratification through homicide, but it's self-sexual gratification. So these individuals may carry what we call murder kits or rape kits in their car, where they, carry around handcuffs and duct tape, and they keep it there because they're looking for opportunities they're always on the hunt, basically, for whoever their victim is. Most of these individuals will use people in what I hate this term, but we still use it, throwaway victim categories. So prostitutes, homeless men, people who live on the street, vagrants. Some may even categorize children in this. And so it's whatever the interpretation is. But it's not a quick kill. It's something that they take a lot of pride in. But the issue is they do get direct sexual pleasure from the victim suffering. So that's very important. Now, there is a problem. There is a larger subtype that falls under hedonistic, which I really disagree with. So there are 3 types of serial killers that kind of come under this umbrella. The first is the one for personal gain. I had mentioned before about organized crime. So if you say that this is hedonistic because they're getting money for it, these would be your contract assassins, people who kill for profit, drug dealers. I have the picture, the middle picture is Richard Kuklinski, who was known as the Iceman, who worked for the 5 families. He would actually solicit himself to all the families to go commit contract homicides. We think he's murdered over 300 people. We also, and this is what I don't like, we put women in this category, because we feel that what women who kill will do it for personal gain. Many of you may know Aileen Wuornos. Charlize Theron portrayed her in the movie Monster a few years ago and won the Academy Award. Aileen Wuornos was not your typical female serial killer, and many people were really ready to discount her whole story because of how she looked and acted in court. She did rob men. She was, marketing herself as a prostitute. And a lot of them said she did it for personal gain. If you do know the Aileen Wuornos story, most people know she was badly abused from the time she was 8 years old. She was raped repeatedly by family members and was basically homeless at 14. And so there was a lot of anger and emotional issues that were involved into when she ended up actually escalating to kill. The other category are angels of mercy. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but Brooklyn, they just arrested one who was killing elderly men and women in nursing homes and in assisted care. Donald Harvey, I have his picture. He was from New Jersey. He killed over 60 people in nursing homes and assisted care facilities around the state of New Jersey. And none of the agencies talked to each other to say, oh, this guy, don't hire him. He's not so good. We've seen issues here. But angels of mercy, I actually believe, fall more into a mission-oriented. If we've interviewed a lot of them, they all say the same thing. We wanted to relieve them of pain. I don't know what made them think they were God to make that decision. But, I think to lump them into what we call comfort-oriented, because there's some gratification of hedonism from that. So that's really my only problem with these typologies, is I just feel, they created this comfort-oriented as a catch-all for serial killings we can't really understand at this point. The last is probably the worst, and this is the power control serial killer. Sex is not really an issue. It's not sexual gratification. It's power and domination over the victim. They want to control. They want to exert power as long as they can over the victim. all of these individuals suffer from a serious character disorder. Most likely they are psychopaths, narcissistic personality disorders. They believe they will get away with it as long as they can. They feel omnipotent with every kill. They feel they increase their power with every kill. And I put the Hillside Stranglers. Now, out of the two, Ken Bianchi, who is on the left, and Angelo Bono, who was his cousin, I'm really looking at Ken Bianchi because he was really the mastermind. They killed 14 women and would put them out posed on the hillsides of California. That's where they got their moniker. But Ken Bianchi really hunted, and he did so much damage. The prep work that was involved. De Bono basically did what he said. And actually, when Angelo was interviewed, we found out that on the intelligence level, he had a 45-50 IQ score. So he really just kind of followed Ken. Ken had done so much. He had falsified a psychiatric degree from UCLA. He had treated patients where he never even went to med school. He put people under hypnosis, and he actually tried to trick the court system by saying he had multiple personality disorder and he didn't commit the crimes. It's probably one of the most unique cases we've ever seen. And then, of course, Ted Bundy, who I know there's been a lot of notoriety with him on Netflix and Amazon Prime. They've done a lot of specials on him. You know, Ted Bundy was a narcissistic person. He is a psychopath. He was a very angry man who hunted his victims. And as he perpetuated his crime, started to lose control. He represented himself, you know, when he was in court. He felt absolutely confident he wasn't going to be, you know, convicted. He had a fan base, which is a whole other lecture to look at, you know, these women who follow these men to the ends of the earth. But it simply empowered him and empowered his control. So, you know, it's very interesting when Ted Bundy was finally apprehended, the last two crimes were completely out of the ordinary for him. One of them was the Omega sorority, where he murdered 6 women in that sorority, and then he murdered a 12-year-old girl. They were very, very quick. They were spontaneous. Not at all like the other 56 women that he did. And just to give you a clue of how intelligent Ted Bundy was, besides the fact that he had been in law school, I mean, Ted Bundy volunteered for working at Suicide Hotline. And this was back in the 1970s, where if you worked Suicide Hotline, you would normally set up to go meet the person for coffee to try to talk them down from doing anything. I mean, we don't even know how many victims he practiced with before he ended up really doing his reign of horror. So that's very important to understand. These guys practice, and they put a lot of time and energy into the fantasy and the implementation of the fantasy. So just generally 5 windows to the killing process, just so you can kind of see how it operates. Now, remember, this is going to vary depending on the serial killer, depending on the fantasy that's involved. But if we were to generalize it, there tends to be 5 steps that are involved. First, it's the fantasy that builds up. And this is where the impulse begins to grow and grow in the person psychically, emotionally, and they begin to be consumed with it. And then they have to go and do the hunt. So they may stalk, they may start to, you know, troll the streets and look for prostitutes. And then there is the abduction phase. And the abduction is not necessarily where they grab somebody and pull them into a van or a car. They could lure the person. They may date the person and romanticize the person. I mean, they may marry the person. We don't know how long that kind of period will be. But then once they do have that person in their clutches, that begins the killing process, which again could be very fast. It could last days. It just depends on the methodology of the individual. And then it's the disposal. So the disposal is very important because when we look at the disposal of the victim, sometimes where they are found is not where they're killed. In many cases, it may be a secondary or tertiary dump site where they put the victim. They may stage the victim. They may put a rose on their chest. They may leave a calling card for the police. They may leave them nude or dressed. They may, it just depends. Sometimes we see what we call depersonalization. If you have a victim where their eyes have been closed, or there's a pillow over their head, or something's covering them, that usually is there to indicate a minimal amount of remorse by the killer because they don't want the victim to see them. So we have to take all of those little factors into consideration when trying to come up with a profile or some sort of theoretical construct with the crime. But again, this is just very general. So if we look at why does looking at serial crime help us? If I'm talking about how we've put a lot of energy into, the media and entertainment, and we're not really seeing what the reality is, it does help us. We have perfected crime scene analysis. We have come 1,000% in examining crime scenes and profiling crime scenes from when we were in 1975. This has helped with interviewing techniques, not just interviewing techniques of offenders, but also interviewing techniques for the victims or survivors or the families. We've learned to become better interviewers as police officers, detectives, homicide detectives, victim advocates, therapists, in looking and kind of being able to link the behavior and the action and how it has been operationalized. So that's very important. One of the best things, or what I do with my students when I teach this as a course, is we actually during the semester start to develop interviewing styles. To interview somebody who is a visionary serial killer, which you could take a lot of those types of methods that you may practice to just talking to offenders who are mentally ill. But it depends. Do you do it in the day or the night? How long, what period of interview do you use? How do you gauge it? Who goes in and does the interview? All of that, it depends. It depends the type of rapist you have, the type of pedophile you have, the type of murderer you have. And so that's what we've been able to extract by studying these types of crimes. Looking at the trends, like I mentioned at the beginning, where if I taught this 10 years ago, it was all interracial. It was white on white, black on black, Latino on Latino crime. Now it's very different and it's much more diversified. Crime mapping, which has become a real tool for criminal justice practitioners, looking at location analysis. Where was the body found? Where is the suspect? Where was the victim picked up? We actually map that out and we are able to find patternings with that. And that helps us then predict when the person may act next, or who is this person who's doing this crime? What type of car do they drive? Possibly what type of job that they have. It helps us work better with survivors and families. Nobody can understand what it's like unless you are a victim of this. And so working with these types of victim advocacy groups has helped us tremendously, not just looking at serial survivors, but also other typologies of crime, from intimate partner violence to sexual assault to child abuse and molestation. And again, I think just examining the current trends with serial crime is a window into the level of violence of our society. I remember years ago, I took a training with Dr. Henry Lee and with Rob Ressler. And I remember Henry Lee making a very interesting comparison with crime in New York. And he said that in the 1980s, that if you were stabbed in New York City, like on the street, you were stabbed an average of 5 to 7 times. But at the time when I took this seminar class, which I believe was 99 or 2000, you were stabbed on average on the street 20 to 30 times. So we have to look at what is happening within our society, and are we becoming more violent? And what are the circumstances that are happening within our society and our trends that may reflect on the state of serial crime that we have right now? So some new trends that we have in the 21st century, I mean, many of you know with the Golden State Killer, genealogy databases are being used now routinely with detectives to look at research and analysis and to trace cold cases and unsolved crimes. Looking at intelligence gathering and analysis, information and intel gathering from other detectives and homicide units around the country. What are the correlations that we can make from this? Examining offenders who are incarcerated or out on probation and parole, examining their trends of child abuse, intimate partner violence, looking at the diagnostic statistical manual of disorders that exist and how that has changed through the years. Exploring new theories in victimology. You know, victimology in the 1980s was not even a term, and now it's a whole field of study. Examining, you know, what do we do that may open ourselves up to possibly being victims? You know, and it's usually not something that is conscious, but I mean, you know, I recently published a paper last year on crimes on the internet, and I was absolutely horrified when I was reading about behavior that occurs there and how many murders were actually done by connecting on the internet. You know, we still think social media at some level is safe. We still think certain dating sites are safe. We think that going to meet somebody in a parking lot at 10:30 at night is safe because we've been in an online relationship for 4 months. So why is that happening? You know, where did this come from? We have to be able to explore this and what societal patterns are happening in our day-to-day lifestyle to make us feel comfortable or more uncomfortable. So we have to look at that. Also with trends, how do we study interviewing techniques and evidence gathering in certain typologies of crime? You know, how has arson investigation helped contribute to examining serial crime? How has looking at rape cases helped contribute to looking at multiple murders or mass violence or spree killers? And then, you know, that extends with crime scene analysis as well. Understanding blood spattering, understanding DNA, understanding, you know, what to look for now, because we've reached such heights with DNA analysis. And then overall, we need to do continual analysis on issues of gender and race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, and crime. So I think those are some interesting areas, and we may not link it with serial crime, but by studying it, it helps kind of open the door on human behavior and how, you know, crime impacts us on a daily basis. So I just wanted to leave you with today some unsolved cases, and there are a lot more I did not add on, believe it or not, but these are all updated. The West Mesa Bone Collector in New Mexico, that's what they've coined him, and they have found a lot of buried bones in West Mesa. They believe they can be connected to 15 different bodies. They don't have enough with DNA because of the weather conditions to even identify most of the victims. There's the New Bedford Highway Killer in Massachusetts. The last we've heard of that killer was in 2017. We recently just had the Brooklyn serial killer with the family slayings and with the elderly. Brazil's Rainbow Maniac is still unsolved after 15 years. I don't know if this guy probably is one of my, I'm really terrified of, but Dr. No, that was his CB handle. He was a truck driver and he would go to truck stops, and we don't know how many prostitutes have been kidnapped and murdered by him. They have basically surveyed that probably 6, but it may be up to 22. And we have no idea who he is, except for his voice. We have him on 911 calls where he calls in to say, "This is Dr. No, I got another one," and then hangs up. The smiley face murders, that was actually a focus, I believe, on Oxygen last year, where a bunch of investigators believe there is a group of serial killers who are actively murdering college-age men in the Midwest. And it's interesting because near their bodies, there was found to be a smiley face. And it's usually done in the wood or on the stone. Nothing conclusive, but they're trying to link all of these deaths together. They're having a bit of a hard time, but some of the general similarities, they're all found close to water. And all of the victims, the last time they were seen were at college bars or hangouts. And so that's where they think the connection can be. Murder in the Bayou, I know that was on HBO last year about the Jeff Davis 8 killers, which is still unsolved. The Volga Maniac, who's probably Russia's worst serial killer, about 32 victims right now, and that is still unsolved in Volga, Russia. Obviously, the Long Island serial killer, I know last year they released the belt and a couple of other pieces of evidence, but we still are unsure about that. And then in Oregon, they are still looking at the Chillicothe killer, who has been linked with 6 deaths, mostly near the highway near Portland, Oregon. So those are just things to look out for. So if you have any questions or information that stem past this talk, I have my email there. And Celeste and Jessica also know how to get in touch with me. And I guess I will open it up to questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can get a gallery view. Does anybody have any questions at all? I probably freaked everybody out. I keep thinking.
I have a question, Dr. Lieber. Do you go to, do the police departments call you, and do you go to local police departments to try to help them?
I've worked on about 10 separate cases, but most of them have been sexual assault cases. Most recently, I worked with NYPD they have a podcast on cold cases, and I worked on one that was in Brooklyn. And that's been unsolved for about 10 years now. And so I was asked to review the file, and then they ended up interviewing me for the podcast. So I helped them with that. So I've worked for cases in Chicago and New York City. There was one in Louisville, Kentucky I did. And then there was one in Virginia that I worked on. Most of it is New York based. And Connecticut.
What an exciting life you have.
Not really, no.
Yeah, it really is interesting and exciting, and how blessed your students are to have someone who's interesting and enjoyable to listen to.
Oh, thank you. I don't think they'd say that, but I appreciate it, Celeste.
Any other questions?
Hello, hi.
Hi.
I do have a quick question about the nature of the changing, you sort of alluded to this throughout your speech, but the changing nature of technology being used in tracking down or possibly preventing future killings by these serial killers. I know that there have been some alumni from my school, John Jay, who have actually gone on to use technology for the predictive policing model, and also for crime mapping to sort of, track down serial killers. So I was wondering if you could, add any more insight about the use of technology in criminal justice.
Well, I think you brought up the predictive policing model. I think the technology with DNA has come so far, and also I also think with educating people in the field of criminal justice. So I know when I was teaching 20 years ago, I would be teaching from one perspective, and now I make sure my students are very familiar with different avenues of DNA. Not just with the typical testing that we do through fingerprinting or luminol or serum testing, but I think this whole, I think this beginning, and I go back to the Golden State Killer, of using genealogy. And I know that's a double-edged sword. I mean, when we submit to do ancestry, there is a risk that even though you have these companies say they will not share your DNA, if a warrant is involved, or if this is possibly going to prevent something, we don't know what's going to happen. We still haven't even made up the laws that correlate with this. It's very similar to international law and cybercrime law. It's still in the process. But I think technology, I hope, or what I hope with my students, is that they do take courses or seminars. I mean, I think one of the greatest seminars I ever took was on blood spatter and gunshot wound analysis, where I was actually testing it, and to be able to see not just what can happen during the course of the crime, but actual step-by-step evidence collection, how to handle evidence, how not to impair the chain of evidence as it's being moved through the court system. And understanding the ethics involved in it, I think, is paramount at this time. But I still see this as a brand new area. You have to, I say to my students all the time, and I actually have one of my colleagues, Dr. Kalika Cox, is on here. She's checking in. But I mean, and I think she can say that and agree with me that, if you take a model of criminal justice, like for example, boot camps, using boot camps with juveniles, which was actually a very new thing to do in the early 90s. It still took us 25 years to assess whether or not it was working. Anything that we do in criminal justice has to be examined over and over and over again, and then monitored in very small increments to see if it even makes a difference in what we're doing. So I think the new DNA push is phenomenal, but I am not surprised with how this is conflicting within our society and with individual rights and privacy rights. But I do think this is the new wave of doing it. So I hope that answers a little bit. I also failed organic chem, so I'm not. Hi, Anne.
Hi, I have a question. We've seen such a lack of civility lately in our cultures, and almost an increase or an increase in cruelty. Mm-hmm. Is there an increase in the serial killer instances? I wondered if they're tied up.
I think we have to see. I think it depends. I look at serial crime as being much more individualized than anything like collective group violence or even with trends. I mean, if we look at when we saw the bulk of serial killers, if we time it out in terms of decades, the 1960s into the early 70s, where, of course, if you look at what was going on in our country with Vietnam and the 60s movement, it makes sense. The 80s, where we saw, the stock market crash and we saw crime go up exponentially. I would not be surprised in 5 years if we reflect back and say, oh, wow, there was an increase. I think COVID is going to be the outlier in this, because we know with COVID, we've seen a significant increase in domestic violence and child abuse, because people are trapped in their homes and they're trapped with their abusers at this point. I think once we open up, we may see a different trend with different types of violent crime on the outside. So yeah, I think, as I always say, when we look at crime, it's interesting when you look at crime data, I have students say to this, why are we looking at 2017? I'm like, because it takes a year and a half to calculate everything. So I think by 2022, we're going to get a really good view on what was happening in terms of crime rates in 2020. We already have a tip of it, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes. Who's talking?
Oh, it's Roisin. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very good.
Thank you.
I just had a question about why serial killers have an MO. If it's clear that this is what's used to identify them, especially with advanced technology and everything.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering if they all just like to use them for attention, or if they actually can't help it, or if it depends on the killer.
Well, I think that's a loaded question. I'm going to take the MO as the term. MO is used all the time as and we look at it as patterning. MOs change through a serial crime. So I'll give you an easy example. So we may have a serial killer where the first two victims were tied up with rope. And then all of a sudden there's a victim who's found with handcuffs. And then somebody says, well, that's not the same person. It definitely could be the same person, because as they commit the crime, they become more empowered and they are able to take risks. MOs change all the time with killers. Signatures do not. So there is a difference between a modus operandi and patterning. And what I think is happening with technology and also with information sharing is we're able to prevent the number of deaths because we are now communicating more. So for example, if you're a detective in Teaneck, New Jersey, and you found two prostitutes in some sort of a position or on the street, and then you call somebody up in Paramus and they found one, well, now we can start to put together and get a task force. And we also have to remember that since 9/11, we have created a multitude of task forces all across, I think, 5 states within Pennsylvania. I mean, New York doesn't just work within New York. They're working with the feds, they're working with Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. So because of that, there's a lot more sharing. And also, they also, with some of these task forces, will have privileges at crime labs, which we never had before. A lot of times, we were stuck with the crime lab we had. And I mean, I'm sure most of you know about 3 or 4 years ago with rape kits, I mean, NYPD came under a phenomenal attack because there was no place to put all of the rape kits. So they were putting it in a garbage bag in a closet. I mean, unfortunately, they don't have enough money or resources to move the amount of evidence that needs to move at a faster level. So, I mean, but I think it has helped. And I think, when we look at the MO, I say all the time, the MO is not necessarily the same. We have to give room for the individual committing serial crime to create him or herself as their own identity. Because remember, this is something that in most cases they feel proud of. And this is their kind of work of art that they're doing. So, that's more power control, obviously mission oriented. They just want to eradicate. So they just want to get these people off the street and target them. But the ones who take the time, the hedonists and the power control, they put a lot of time and a lot of effort into what they think their creation is. And so that's where I think it becomes more disturbing, but we have to be more open to it.
Kathy?
Yes?
I was wondering, have there been studies of the brain functions of these convicted serial killers? I mean, do their brain waves and whatever else they're looking at, operate the same way as in non-convicted serial killers.
Yeah, no, and again, it goes to typology. I think one of the most famous ones was Arthur Shawcross. He was examined by a neuroscientist and psychiatrist named Helen Morrison for many years. And she had told and testified to the fact that he had severe frontal lobe abuse because he was beaten as a child. And because of the beatings he took in the head, that actually impaired his emotional impulses. And basically, as she said, made him dead inside emotionally. So, I mean, we never examined Bundy that much. I mean, as we just had the words of Ted Bundy. But for all accounts, I think Bundy's brain worked fine. I mean, he was a lawyer. He worked for the Republican National Committee for a year and a half. He was a volunteer at Suicide Hotline. He had a fiance. He knew how to socially interact. But some of them do that. Joel Rifkin tried to look at neurological impairment as well, but it didn't work, in the defense part. So, but we have looked at it. I mean, I don't think we can discount that if somebody suffers tremendous physical abuse as a child, that it is not going to have an impact on their behavior in some form or another, whether it be in cognitive development, whether it be in terms of neurology, whether it be in terms of behavioral issues, it's going to be there. It just depends on the situation. Hi, Susan. You're muted.
Hi, my question is, even since 9/11, you hear about these cases where there was the guy in Texas in the Army who shot up a bunch of people, and he'd had a history, and the Army had never been communicating with police, or the police had never been So these things still keep happening, that these agencies are not communicating. Maybe local police forces are between Paramus and Newark, but are the states throughout the country communicating? Is the FBI communicating? I mean, it still seems to be happening.
Well, no, I agree it does, but you also have to remember the military is its own entity. The military considers itself its own being. They don't communicate with federal agencies unless they have to, like with the National Guard, but they are their own, and they have their own judicial system. They have their own prisons. It's like a microcosm. And that's why it's considered very different. In terms of the task forces that exist now, which we have the Joint Terrorism Task Force, we have the Firearms Task Force, we have the Human Trafficking Task Force, we have a lot of them. There is much more communication. However, when we're looking at issues like the mass shooter, unless that entity is closely following the people who work with them, it's a serious issue. I mean, if we think about even within law enforcement, the suicide rate for law enforcement this past year in 2020 was the highest we've had in the history of American policing. Never have we seen the amount of suicides among law enforcement officers than we did in 2019 and 2020. And that also goes to correctional personnel and correction officers. We've never seen it at this level. And so then we have to ask ourselves, what is the agency doing to help with employee assistance or mental health care? Right now we've been distracted with COVID and what we're feeling and what we're all individually going through and suffering in our families. But in 2019, we had serious mental health issues going in among many criminal justice agencies that were not attended to. So when this pandemic's over, we really are going to have to go in and pick up where we left off and try to fix it, because there's just too much. But to get back to information sharing, I don't think we perfected it. I think we've gotten a lot better. But again, that linkage blindness, if you have that detective who decides in and of itself, I'm going to solve this case, they're going to have tunnel vision with how to open it up. It's the detectives that are very open to saying, I need help with this, where then they begin to entertain, you know, other people. You know, I'm always amazed when my phone rings and it's a detective. I'm always amazed and say, listen, I think I just want to consult with you on something. Can I just throw something at you and see if the pasta sticks on the wall? You know, to me, that's a huge step. So I still tread very carefully with it, but I think we've definitely gotten a lot better. Any other questions?
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Devin. How are you?
So good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So I was curious, I wanted to jump back to the conversation about the pandemic and COVID specifically, and was wondering if you had any thoughts on the fact that because we've all kind of been stuck inside and COVID has kind of taken away some major social and cultural points of interaction within society, and potentially, I'm assuming, places where those who have the inclination to commit serial crime are selecting victims and, you know, participating in some of those fantasization and stalking behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's affected, or we will see an effect with that? Do you think that as we start to go back to social interaction, you know, going out to bars and restaurants and stuff, that there's going to be a significant uptick? I was just wondering.
I think so. I think, you know, serial killers are amazing that they have this ability to be dormant. Like, and I go back to Arthur Shawcross because I think he was actually absolutely fabulous in terms of a characterization of dormancy. You know, when the FBI came into Rochester to look at Arthur Shawcross, I remember Greg McCrary was the lead profiler on it. And he said, he goes, he's a male, he's in his 30s, he drives a really bad car, he gets paid cash, he's terrible, he has no job, no education, and everything fit but the age when they caught him. And it turned out Shawcross had murdered a child and had served 23 years. So when he got out, he was 53. And that's when the rampage started. So yeah, I'm sure there is a percentage that are biding their time right now. I'm sure there are some that maybe have been trying to practice with the internet and to see, but I think, again, we're going to have to look at the rates in 2 years. I think, my personal opinion, we will see a jump in this. I do. I really do. You just can't have these people, you know, I mean, we've seen so many bizarre trends. Like, I mean, the weirdest trend for me this year with the pandemic has been people's cars getting stolen. You know, and we've seen areas like Yonkers and in Lower Westchester. And I remember watching one of the news programs, they were interviewing a woman whose BMW was stolen. And she was like, well, I've just left my fob in the car. And they're like, do you always leave your fob? And she goes, no, I just didn't think anybody would steal it during a pandemic. And I'm thinking to myself, why would you think nobody would still steal a car because it's a pandemic? Like, we're going to be really nice to one another, like all of a sudden. But I think that's what's interesting. We're going to have to look back at what our behaviors have been during this year, and then look at the crime rates and then try to find the correlations moving forward. You know, we've had so much impact us. We've had new bail reform issues come in. We've seen recidivism start to skyrocket. We've seen compassionate release where a lot of individuals have been released from prison, many of whom should have been, but I'm sure there have been a few who should not have been, but because of COVID, were let out. So I think we're really going to have to carefully monitor it. That's my way of answering, not answering, and not having a
I love it.
Any other questions?
Kathy, I was just going to tell you there's a question in the chat from
Diana. There is?
Yes.
Oh.
Do you see it?
When a person is interviewed, no, they don't have to. Well, it depends. I'm going to say it depends. When I've gone in to be a possible expert witness, the attorney who hires me usually gets consent to not be present. But it depends. It just depends on the case. If it's dealing with a sexual assault or a very serious crime or patterning, it depends if I'm doing it for defense or prosecution. Prosecution usually monitors my intake. Defense, if I'm hired by defense, they usually let me handle it myself and report back. So it just depends. Usually if I do any intake with an offender before a conviction, or I'm doing it at a jail, there will be a probation officer or a court officer there, or their attorney. But again, I hate to be so general about it. It depends on the circumstances of the crime. It really does. Interviewing a victim, I usually interview them alone because I'm certified to do that. But if the victim is very fragile, I usually have a psychologist or mental health counselor, whoever their care or their advocate is at the time. So I hate to be more plain about it, but it really depends on the situation.
Any more, ladies? Well, if there are no further questions.
Oh, can I ask a question?
Sure.
It's Rita.
Oh, okay. Oh, Night Stalker, really?
No, I have a question about, you talked a little bit about serial killers and race.
Right.
And you're saying that my question is there really an uptick in serial killers that are people of color, or are they always there, but law enforcement just ignored the victims?
I think if I have to tell you, I think there is an uptick because they're up by 39%. If it was like 10%, I would say that could just be they're getting recognized more. But I think anything over 25%, I really attribute to patterning. I think there is. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons why. I think the gang phenomenon and how mainstream gang behavior has been has given some credence to that. I also think narcotics trafficking as well contributes with that, and human trafficking. But yeah, I think I honestly, because I was looking at those figures the other night when I was preparing for it, and the decade difference between 2000 to 2010 and then 2010 to 2020 it's just a huge increase. Much more than any other decade we've seen. So, but I was also, Rita, I was also looking at it from the perspective of the victimology as well, and the trends with the victimology. But they tend, with the Black serial killers that we've seen, it tends to victimize small children from poor communities or prostitutes, and it cuts across race with the prostitutes.
Well, if there are any more questions, last shot.
Last shot.
If not, thank you so much, Dr. Lavery. It was such a wonderful, wonderful program. And
thanks, Celeste. Thank you all for having me.
Oh, we love having you, and you were back by popular demand. So sit tight and you'll get another letter, another email. Thanks.
That's so great. Anytime.
Time and sharing all your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Okay, ladies, you're welcome. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for joining in. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yes, it did. Excellent job.